Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I am your host, Annette Lyon, USA Today bestselling author of Just One More and a whole lot of other books. Today we are talking a lot more about Ruby Franke and her husband Kevin Franke, and we're going into Jodi. A lot that has come out. There's some misconceptions that are out there that I think someone who understands the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, having been in it, I am a active faithful member, understands and can maybe get some insight too that I haven't seen anyone point out yet. Today's chocolate is the Cadbury Caramello King Size, so we'll be partaking of that soon. Last time I read excerpts from Ruby's journal. I want to read a few more. I did the first 20-ish pages or so last time. This time I'll cover the last 40 briefly, but I'm not going to go into lots of detail because it is, as the journal continues and gets closer to Ruby's arrest, the abuse gets worse, and the descriptions of what she recounts and happily records gets worse, and I don't want to go into really big detail about some of that. So I just want to bring out a few of quotes here and there. I mentioned last time how she was like just amazed or disturbed that her son, and I'll refer to her, the two youngest, R and E. Their names are public, but I won't be using them. She talks about how R just doesn't react to anything. He's cold, he's callous, that kind of thing. He has zero remorse, zero fear, zero expression. He is cold, calloused, and hard. And I'm sitting there going, he is probably dissociating at this point. He's under so much pain. He's had to go numb. Response to abuse, not a sign of being evil. Woman, he's barely 12. Come on. Okay, so she talks about the need to come down to the St. George area. Technically Ivans, but basically the St. George area. They needed things to get hard, fast, intense, shocking change, immediate discomfort, stress to their systems. Because in her minds, that is what was going to create change. There's just a lot more that's redacted in this chunk, and I have a feeling that's because it's even more disturbing than what we are able to see. They took out really, really bad stuff, which I can only imagine. But she says here, and this is something that there's several parts here that I want to bring out because it is completely as if abuse itself isn't opposed to my faith. Obviously not okay. So much of this, but a lot of what she's doing, she's justifying based on her beliefs, and they are completely contrary to that of our faith. So she specifically says that they think that they're the victims and that she and Jodi are persecutors. Yeah. And then she goes, the burning in hell isn't real. And I want to go, woman, remember, I mentioned this last time too, we don't believe in hell, like an eternal burning hell. We don't. We believe that everyone will have to be punished for their sins, but that punishment will come to an end. And then you'll enter one of the kingdoms of glory according to whatever. The idea that eternal burning hell, they don't think is real. Like, well, in theory, woman, you don't believe that either. Or at least, your faith doesn't, supposedly. It makes me so sad that she looks on her children as if they're these horrible. She actually at one point refers to R as a weak-minded, undisciplined brat. That just breaks my heart. But here he is. This is shortly after she tried talking to him, and he is clearly trying to do what she wants, trying to go along with what is mom wanting me to do. I will do that. So she had given him a book to read and some milk, and he was inside of the air conditioning. And he goes, you like that, don't you? And he goes, yes, ma'am. Which again, ma'am, referring to your mother is just a sad thing in my mind. If he really didn't want evil anymore, or thanks for the book, but I want to do boxes today, meaning carrying boxes up and down stairs, like hard labor all day long. Like, yeah, if he really wanted to change, whatever. If you're going to do good work, it has to be painful. Okay, whatever. And then at one point, this breaks my heart, where she takes her children out to this Native American cemetery on a reservation to pull weeds and bare feet, so it hurts more. She actually says that. And at one point, her daughter E is crying, and she went out in the heat barefoot. She says she screamed for another family, water, food, care, love. Oh, E, a manipulative ploy. Oh heavens, I'm like, this poor girl, literally, like, this is like when R said in the first little chunk that I read before, he wanted a different mother. He would prefer a glass of water to having her as a mother. Now her daughter is saying, I want another family. I want love. And her mom's like, oh, you're just evil. How hard must her heart have become to look at her own children and be able to be like, I cannot grasp it. And she says, the Lord told us, and this is the only, maybe the one little piece of like, maybe this little piece of her conscience was waking up a tiny bit. Didn't last clearly, but the Lord told her, don't continue these physical interventions. It will only bring resentment. You think? And then she says that she's watching Jodi cleaning her daughter, her wounds. And she says, I witnessed Jodi cleaning what didn't deserve to be cleaned. And this is including her feet. And all I could think of was, you know what? You claim to follow the Savior. And what did Jesus Christ do? Put clean feet. And she doesn't think her own daughter deserves to have her wounds cared for. That just pisses me off. Let's just say that. It seems like no matter what he says, she will not accept it. So at one point she says, well, why didn't you manipulate this yesterday? And he said, because he wanted to change. Isn't that what she's been wanting this whole time? But then she replied saying, no, that's not true. You didn't manipulate because you weren't uncomfortable. You weren't hot. Like he can't win. You can't win. And then she points out to the rocks in the backyard. Rocks, mind you. These are rocks. She says, you desecrated these rocks and the rain is cleaning them. Rocks aren't sacred, people. How does a child just desecrate rocks? That's messed up and it pisses me off. And at one point then he says, take me to jail where I belong. When I first heard the whole story and how he asked for the police of the neighbor, I thought, wow, I'm surprised he trusts the police. He didn't necessarily. He probably honestly thought, well, if I go to jail, that's where bad people go. I'm bad, but at least I get food and it's air conditioned. I'll have a bed. After this, most pages are redacted, which just gives me chills. This is on page 34. She says to him, her son, when did you sell your soul to the devil? And she means this literally, mind you. He says 2 or 3. Does he even have memories of that age? Most people don't. But let me also bring out that an element of big tenet of our faith is that children do not get baptized until the age of 8, because it's not until the age of 8 that they are accountable for their actions, that they understand right and wrong, and before that the devil has no control over them. That's it. Before the age of 8, it's impossible. It'd be impossible for a 2 or 3-year-old child to sell their soul to the devil. We don't believe that was not possible based on our teachings and our beliefs. So I don't know where her brain is and why that she thinks that's even possible. Then the last thing I'll read here, or I'll just refer to it, is she's forcing him to be on this mini trampoline, and she's giving him balance and coordination tasks, and he falls over during one of them and smacks his nose on the ground and it starts to bleed, and she gets really annoyed because she gets him toilet paper to wipe it and just makes it more of a mess and all this stuff. And she's like, he just refuses to do these exercises. He has the decrepit stature of someone who's like 90 years old. And I'm thinking, maybe that's because you aren't feeding him and giving him water and you're making him stay outside 24/7 in the freaking summer heat of the middle of the desert. There's that would have a toll on a body. Okay, that's all we'll talk about on the journals today. Some miscommunications, new information that we have, and then go into a timeline of Kevin, and Kevin is Ruby's husband, and some of Jodi's things. One that was new information is that R did not know that his sister E was still at the house. So he hadn't seen her in a month. So they had kept them apart. So we're essentially talking like solitary confinement, except for when he sees the people who are hurting him. And then we're talking, hard labor and not enough food and water. And we're talking, this is against the Geneva Convention for Prisoners of War. Like, give me a break. Like, how can you justify this for anybody? That is a misconception I wanted to bring up, was that a lot of people have said, make sure you go to actual professionals that have licenses and stuff to get your mental health, because clearly someone like Jodi is not. Jodi actually was a licensed therapist, and that's part of the danger here. She was even on a referral list for Brigham Young University students seeking therapy. I'd be shocked if she's still on that. She had at one point, you're probably familiar with Adam Steed's story. horrific stuff. Because of him, her license was temporarily revoked. Too bad it wasn't permanently revoked. But I also would be shocked if both of Ruby and Jodi, if they have not yet been excommunicated. We know for sure, for example, that Tim Ballard has been excommunicated, but the church doesn't comment, and they won't comment on things like that. They won't. So with Tim Ballard, that information was leaked from his local someone in his local congregation who had access to some records leaked it to somebody else, and that's how we have information for sure on that. But I would be shocked if they weren't already excommunicated, or if that process isn't happening, because everything that they've done is so egregious. But Jodi was a therapist, and that is part of the problem with all this. Ruby was listed on her connections website as like a certified life coach, and so, but Ruby had no professional training. And life coach is such a generic term. There's no regulation, at least in the state of Utah, and I believe the legislature is taking that up and saying we need to fix this. We need to have some sort of guidelines for what that even means, because anyone can call themselves a life coach, and there's just nothing. There's no safety rails there. So we need to fix that. One thing that's so incredibly sad and ironic with Jodi being a therapist is that as a therapist, you are a mandated reporter if you are aware of a child experiencing the very kinds of things that she was inflicting. And that just is making me just rage, right? One of the jail phone calls, Ruby is talking to her parents, and we find out that they are 8 hours ahead. And some people are like, I don't even know where that would be or what that even means. So 8 hours ahead of Utah is essentially Central Europe. So we're talking like England is 7 hours ahead of Utah. So if you go a little bit farther east, you get into, Spain, France, Norway, up to about Poland, Hungary-ish, that area. So Italy, Germany, all of that is 7 or 8 hours ahead of Utah time. Why would her parents be there? Very likely they're probably serving a couple's senior mission for the church. That's something that's very common that couples will do after retirement. They'll often work in the mission office doing administrative work. I know a couple that served a mission, and they would drive around and help missionaries make sure they had smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, and make sure their batteries are up to date, and they would install furniture or just little fix it. So that, there's all kinds of things that seniors can be doing, serving in temples, various places. So I suspect her parents are probably on a mission somewhere in Central Europe. Don't know for sure, but that's insight as to what I believe could logically be happening. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. Got a lot of notes, so I'm going to just kind of book through some of this. Some of this information comes from Jessica Danielle, who did a deep dive on some of Jodi's stuff and her background. So Jodi went to grad school in the University of Utah, and she jokes how, you're not supposed to talk about you're a member of the church up there, and people have gone, well, why? Number one, actually, you wouldn't bring that up in a therapy or therapeutic type psychology situation. That's inappropriate. Even I'm asking students or professors their religion, that's not legal. You don't do that. But University of Utah is like at the heart of Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake City is definitely far more liberal than the rest of the state. It's a big blue patch and a big red state. So it definitely is. That was, people talk about, I couldn't say I was from BYU or a member of the church, and people would just chuckle or whatever. Supposedly, her thesis chair asked her what her thesis would be on, what she was going to study and write about. And she decided to talk about women's sexuality and the church, which in theory sounds like a great idea. I don't know that her approach necessarily was healthy because of what it turned into, obviously, but apparently she presented some of this at the Sunstone Symposium. So Jessica Danielle wasn't sure what that was. And Sunstone there's a whole bunch of a subtext. So Sunstone at one point was viewed as a very left-wing, fringy, almost anti, but not quite. A lot of people who have been part of Sunstone at one point were excommunicated or whatnot. In my personal opinion, it's not fringy anymore. I think that the view was kind of shifted. It is definitely a little liberal leaning, which is why it's kind of surprising that Jodi would present there. Although the topic maybe is one that she could present there and not somewhere else. Don't know. But that was right around 2001 is when she began her research into that topic. She's also doing presentations about how she grew up in a home. This is painful, like that you want to go, do you not see yourself? Look in the mirror here. She grew up in a home where she was not allowed to emote. You're not allowed to show your own emotions. Oh, gee, Jodi, what do you do if a child won't do that? Yeah, well, she says that because her parents wouldn't allow her to emote, she developed an eating disorder because she had to be able to control something. So I'm like, yeah, well, you clearly like to control other people. Clearly, this is what you've been doing in her practice and in connections and with the Frankie children and the Frankie marriage, which we'll get to in a second. But the idea that she admits that it was an unhealthy home because she wasn't allowed to emote, and yet she won't allow other people to have their emotions blows my mind. She claims to have had tens of thousands of patients across 20 years. She says this in 2020, but if you back up, her research wasn't begun until 2001, and she didn't have her degree yet. So she wasn't licensed for 20 years at the point she was claiming she'd been practicing for 20 years. Math doesn't math. Hello. Eventually, she has a practice in like the Cirque Lodge. Jessica Danielle brings that up. She lists celebrities. That was part of like a rehab center. And apparently Jodi mentions that she like Paris Hilton was there and she helped Paris Hilton. I'm thinking, okay, how about the confidentiality thing? That was a thing even then. Yeah, there's no excuse for her saying, oh yeah, I helped with Paris Hilton. Although in today, we know that Paris Hilton had some abuse. So by Jodi, I don't know. Wouldn't surprise me. Opinion, who knows? But yeah, she went on to then do a Sunrise Counseling Center. Connections was in that building. The 8 Passengers was already going strong, and Ruby was making a lot of money with it. People wonder how soon Jodi got into the picture, because in hindsight, people looked. Of course, the videos are gone now, but some people have managed to, they save certain clips, and you've probably seen some of them, like when E forgot to pack her lunch. And then the teacher called and said she has no lunch. And you go, well, that's just a consequence, which is fine if you're 16. This child was in kindergarten, so 5 or 6. No, that's not okay. That's, yeah, but whatever. And then that was one of the earlier times of like, Ruby, you have some messed up ideas of what parenting should be like. That was, if I did some of the math, it looks like that was shortly before she and Jodi met. So Ruby already had some problematic issues. They just got far worse when Jodi showed up. When Kevin came in for, I believe it's his second interview with the police, this is sometime after they're arrested, he starts giving a lot of information about what then happened with Jodi and when she entered their home or in their lives in general. Started out as just like a therapy kind of thing that Ruby got very excited about and wanted him to join in on, and he went to some of the big meetings and like a symposium kind of a mini conference type situation. And the way he put it goes, it just felt like a lot of women that were hating and bashing on men. He didn't like this, but the pressure on him was so intense to just be part of it. There was Ruby and Jodi, and then Pam Botcher, which you may have heard of her, and we may get to her in a minute. They were all pressuring him to join in. And so it sounds like this man didn't have much of a backbone, unfortunately. And he's like, well, fine. I'll do the 3-month thing and then call it quits. So he was a 3-month like addiction thing for men. And he did not like it. But at the same time, Ruby seemed to be warming up to him and being like, oh, this is helpful. We aren't as intimate as often, but he said it was better in a lot of ways and that kind of thing. But things just got worse and worse. Apparently Ruby is getting jealous that Jodi has this other family she's closer to, the Hannahs, and apparently Jodi had some sort of breakdown. The Hannahs brought her into their home so she could kind of recover for a bit, and then stories diverge as to what happened next. I have no idea. This is just the different stories I've heard based on things that I've, Kevin's own interview as well as other little things I've seen online. I have no idea. The Hannah said that, oh, well, the Jodi was like hurting herself with knives, tried to come on and seduce the husband and that kind of thing. No idea if that's accurate, but that was their perception. They kick her out. They went down to Ivan St. George area and stayed with Jodi in her house. I think this was after she was kicked out from the Hannahs. Not positive, but somewhere within a few months of this, they were down there, and he goes, I'm an engineer. I'm smart. I've been an engineering professor. I can't explain this stuff, but he says that there were, plates flying off counters and cupboards shutting on their own. It would sound like things are walking up the walls, and it sounds like he's describing like a haunted house kind of thing. Anyway, they go back home, And then Jodi's having a nervous breakdown, and Ruby says, honey, we need to bring her into our house. And he goes, I don't like that idea. But of course, this is Kevin. He has no backbone. He eventually gives in. He's like, well, it'll sit somewhere. We can make some fun activities, whatever. It'll just be a brief thing. Oh, this was like, I was describing some of this to my husband. He goes, this is like inviting the vampire into your house. I'm like, oh, that's exactly what it turned into. Yeah. She comes in and their whole life falls apart. They start having these revelations. She calls them interventions. So Jodi, Ruby, and Pam would go up into a room and lock themselves in for 4 hours or so at a time and have what they called interventions, where she would describe Jodi having revelations and visions, and then Ruby would write them down, record everything into what was later called the pen papers. And Kevin actually, as the first thing he almost asked the cops, did you get the pen papers? In this interview, they're like, what's that? And he goes, well, it's like a huge, like hundreds of handwritten pages that they were recording everything that they did, and they wouldn't want it to be found for sure. Apparently, these are the visions and revelations that they believed would be scripture someday when God deemed them to become forth. That this is definitely like an LDS dog whistle kind of a situation where Jodi is envisioning herself as a Joseph Smith person who is the founder prophet of our faith, who there are times of him having visions and revelations and describing them, and someone nearby, like Oliver Cowdery was one, who'd write them down and record them. That sounds a whole lot like that. They're putting that onto themselves. At one point, they took a trip down to Mexico to get prescription drugs for their emergency kits. I'm like, hey, we also as a church believe in obeying the law. That doesn't sound legal, but whatever. So I do wonder if they brought back psychedelics that were, whether it's a ketamine or a psilocybin or something, and they were having these trips. And that's sadly something Tim Ballard did as well. He had ketamine and thought he was speaking to Book of Mormon prophets and justifying things. So I don't understand. It's bizarre. Kevin is still trying to walk the walk and go through the therapy stuff. And Jodi, while she's in their house, she is starting to feel like she's being tortured by demons. And so she can't sleep through the night. Sometimes it's once or twice a night. And she calls, and Ruby and Kevin come in, and he has to, he calls himself the resident exorcist, I think he said, having to help her and cast out these demons every day. Sometimes it was every hour. And after a while, Ruby goes, you know what? I'll just sleep with her. And so Kevin is relegated elsewhere, and Ruby and Jodi are sharing a bed. Wondered if they were actually having an affair. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised the way Jodi was so brainwashed or brainwashing other people. Who knows? I don't know. But at one point, so this is something else that blows my mind, though. So if Jodi believes that her house is haunted, which she did, and she believed she was being tormented by demons and all of this, how is it that her methodologies with connections is real? Because some of the videos that she posts are things like, oh, well, if you're true to yourself, you can be healed of anything. You won't be sick with these whatever. I'm sorry, but if you're being traumatized by all these other things, aren't you then evil? Aren't you? Why isn't this working for you, Jodi? This is the system you created. But essentially, she starts isolating Kevin more and more. Eventually, it's like, you need to have a separation in the house, but it's a separation. So he can leave the home whenever he wants to, but he's not allowed to return without Ruby's consent. He can only go into the kitchen when Ruby says he can. Things like that. Like, he can't go upstairs at all because that's Jodi's domain. Very strict. He's getting cut off from all kinds of things. Jodi is the one pulling all the strings and making all these decisions, and somehow Ruby is okay with this. I don't understand. At one point, Jodi manages to get Ruby believing that she should hand over all of her assets, including the 8 passengers, all of their money, their house, their cars, everything. And Kevin admits he was pretty close to going ahead with it simply because whatever it takes to make Ruby happy, maybe I'll get my family back. He knew that these intervention revelation sessions were happening, and I'm thinking, if he understands even the basics of our religion, why didn't he then call her out and go, okay, scripture doesn't come to some random person, it's supposed to come to the leaders, and then it's, that's not how revelation works. If it's going to be scripture, that's not how this happens. But also, wouldn't he have turned to church leaders and said, I think there's a problem here? And kind of what Lori Vallow's brother Adam tried to do with Charles to get her help. They were going to set up an intervention with her stake president, who is like the leader of a diocese type of a thing, we have wards that are congregations, and a stake is a bunch of geographical wards, and the stake president is over the stake. And the stake president would have the authority to say, you are not living as you should. I am taking away your temple recommend, which means you can't enter the temple and do ordinances and work there, which is different from Sunday services. But the temple, you have to live, abide, whatever. And the stake president has the right to take away your temple recommend. So would the bishop. I'm wondering why Kevin didn't go to those leaders and say, here are some things that Jodi is doing or my wife are doing. This doesn't feel right. It feels like it's iffy. And that they wouldn't call her in and say, hey, let's talk. What's going on? This seems a little strange. Let's get you some help. Or like, people say, why didn't Kevin try to get a divorce? That's kind of a last ditch thing for a lot of people in our faith. It does not have the same stigma as it did some time ago, but it's not something, it's your eternal family. You want to save it, right? And it does, honestly, it really sounds like, even with 8 Passengers videos, the Kevin was a passenger in his own life, like in his own marriage. It feels like he was the kind of guy who's like, just goes along to get along. So I don't think he was active really in raising the children. I think that was all Ruby. The punishments, the consequences, all of that stuff, I think that was Ruby, but he never stepped in to stop it either. So I think he's complicit, but he didn't necessarily do those things back then. Still upsets me that he won't be charged with anything. So, because unless Ruby is charged with hurting her children from pre St. George era in their home 8 Passengers time, neither will Kevin, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen for her. And he didn't do anything. He was, to me, again, I think he's complicit by his presence and inaction, but there's nothing to really charge him for. That said, I don't think he has any right to have custody. I don't think he should. Because eventually, as we know, Jodi's was like, okay, this at-home separation's not working. And then Ruby's like, yeah, you're not changing. You're manipulative and you're selfish and da-da-da. Get out of the house. So he left the house. People are saying, well, how can you leave for he was gone for 13 months before they were arrested. And he's like, people are saying, well, how can you be gone that long and not contact your children? I have the same questions. I will say, though, he didn't anticipate it being 13 months before he saw his kids again. He probably was going day by day and just hoping he could get back into Ruby's good graces, which meant getting into Jodi's good graces, which was never going to happen. It does not sound like a guy who ever takes action. It's sort of like, I'll just pray that things work out. He doesn't sound like someone who steps forward and says, this is wrong. I'm going to stop it. And I wonder how much of that is because culturally, we have a scripture that says, that contention is of the devil. And then I think, unfortunately, we end up with too many people who see that and they feel like any sort of disagreement or things that feel uncomfortable, that must be contention, therefore it's of the devil. And that's not it. In my opinion, that is completely wrong. That if you're going to be a peacemaker, sometimes that means stepping into the fray of things that are not peaceful and brokering peace and fixing the problem and that kind of thing. But instead, and I've seen this across so many people of my faith, where they take a passive role and they're like, well, I'm not going to bring it up because contention. And so they either become passive passengers and other people just steamroll over them, or they turn into passive aggressive manipulators of their own because it's not, hey, I'm not causing a fight, I'm not yelling, but I'm getting what I want by being manipulative. So I see both of those things. Both of them are very unhealthy and they're not in line with our teachings. But I think he was the former. He would just sit around and not respond and not act because I want to have peace in the house. And I'm like, dude, get a spine. Okay. He does talk also about Jodi and Ruby being in trances, of Jodi looking possessed, which again makes me think, why in the world wasn't she then, how could she justify treating R and E in the way she did? When if she is being possessed, shouldn't she be treated the same way? Shouldn't she have these hard labor and horrible conditions placed upon her for change? What? But children? Again, math is not math. How on earth can you claim that someone should be treated horribly if you're also experiencing something that you believe is evil? And back with the Hannahs, there was a point with that Ruby was when Ruby was jealous of the Hannah family and how close they were, and she wanted to know what they were talking about, and, their revelations and whatever. They told her, "Oh, what we're doing is not secret; it's sacred." That's another LDS dog whistle. That's often what is talked about when it comes to sacred ceremonies of the temple. Especially, in decades past, people were like, oh, you can't utter a single word that's said in the temple. And I'm like, okay, how about the, and, is, was? plenty of words you can say that there are only very specific things we're not supposed to talk about, but people would think, oh, anything to do with the temple we're not supposed to talk about, which is a lot of crap. But the idea was, oh, it's not secret, it's sacred. And you'll still hear that phrase. It's not secret, it's sacred. And to have the Hannahs and Jodi use that phrase to Ruby adds a little bit, doesn't it? When Ruby and Jodi were arrested and her two youngest children were found in the Ivins home in southern Utah, they weren't sure again where the other two minor children were. So Kevin and Ruby have 6 children. The 2 oldest were already out of the house, adults, although their poor oldest son, Chad, dealt with a lot of crap with Ruby and Jodi in particular as well. But Sherry, the oldest, she'd even called child services asking for, or even the police asking for a welfare check on her siblings. She knew from personal experience that things were not okay at home. And that was before Jodi showed up. But she knew her parents would just leave for trips, leaving the little kids at home by themselves. Like, hi, Kevin, you're complicit in this crap. What's going on? They find them hours north in American Fork. And so the family lives in Springville. That's where the Springville home is. Then there's like Provo and BYU. And then a couple of cities north of that is American Fork. It's maybe 30 miles or so north of Springville. And that is where Pam Botcher lives. And the girls were with her. And the police showed up to her house and they were like, we're taking the girls. And they're like, what are they doing here? And she goes, well, they come and they do chores for me a lot. That's like a normal thing. And if you're hiring teenagers to do chores, that's one thing, but they just come to your house and do chores. Pam apparently was part of Connections. She was one of the head leader people of Connections, and she was also part of these Revelation intervention meetings down in Springville at Ruby's house with Jodi. Weird stuff. I have a feeling that Pam may be charged with something down the road. Don't know. We'll find out. Just opinion here. So at this point, then, we have 4 minor children. We have 2 adult children. And Sherry, the oldest student at BYU, she posts when her mom was first arrested. She posts on Instagram a picture of the arrest and then a word across it saying, finally. That's telling. And is given, I believe, temporary custody of at least the teenage sisters. And so she goes to the family home to get some of their stuff. Like, she needs their stuff, right? She's been in the house lots of times. She has a key. Their thing. She goes in there with a police escort. She's like, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where my dad is or whatever. Things are weird right now. Would you come with me while I go get stuff for my siblings? And the cops are like, yeah, sure. So they go with her to the Springville home. And she then gets some of the stuff. At one point, I believe the police, when they were trying to find some of the siblings, this might have been before that, broke into the home and there was a pane of glass from a door that was broken or something. But because of all of those things, Kevin then is like, oh, my daughter Sherry broke into our home and stole stuff. So he's trying to get her arrested on burglary charges. And so there's police body cam recordings of him going, why can't you arrest her? And they're like, well, this is her home. And by the way, this is a home that Kevin hadn't stepped foot in 13 months. She didn't break in. This is her home. Yeah, she's a college student, but this is her family home. Like, what? But he's like, well, I guess I'll talk to my lawyer about that. So I'm trying to figure out where Kevin's brain is, because I think that some of the things that we've heard in later months, it sounds like he's starting to come around to recognizing just how unhealthy and twisted and brainwashed Ruby was, and then how complicit, or at least, I'm sure he feels like a victim, and on some level he is. Although as a parent, I blame him a lot. Pisses me off that he would just sit back and go, okay, whatever. But it sounds like he's starting to grasp the manipulations a little bit better. But then why would he come back and then say, well, arrest my daughter? But for her, she's trying to essentially step in and be the parent that her 2 siblings don't have right now, and he's trying to get her arrested for it. That makes me so mad. Like, he also thinks he's smart because he's an engineering professor, or he was, and yet when his first interview, the police say your children were found emaciated. He goes, what does that mean? They had to define the word emaciated to a college professor. Yeah, you're brilliant, dude. I believe he felt completely isolated, but he did have leaders he could have turned to, and I don't know why he didn't. That seems completely bizarre that he would just sit back and be like, I don't know. In the height of his time with Jodi and her men's group, he confessed to things he didn't do, which is exactly what his children did as well. And it sounds like a lot of other men he talked to after the fact were like, I did too. Because that's part of the coercion, that you have to admit to things or that you never did, just to appease the person who's torturing him. Which makes me then think, does he have no empathy or predictive skills for his own children? Because if Jodi did that to him, a grown man, why wouldn't she do the same thing to his children? And if he had such a scary experience in what felt like a haunted house in Ivan's, why did he let his children go there? And maybe he didn't know they were down there at that point, but then why wouldn't he check in with his kids? Like, it doesn't sound like he even texted his Sherry or Chad, who are adults, and he wasn't necessarily away from. Like, I would have more sympathy for him if he had shown, behavior of being a good father prior to all of this, but it sounds like he was just a hands-off dude that was like, oh, well, I go to work and I pay the bills and I'm a good dad. And no, you weren't. You weren't protecting your kids even then. You let Ruby run the show entirely. You guys were not partners. You were trying to keep the peace, but you weren't making peace, and you were not avoiding contention at all. You were just sitting on your butt. It says the last time I had communication with Jodi was July of 2022, which appears to be when he was kicked out of the house and that 13 months away from his kids began. One other little sad moment when he actually tried escaping once before, which wasn't terribly hard on the one hand because he was forced to be outside, but he was in the middle of nowhere and he then ran away, and then he was then caught and brought back. But he left a message though in stones. Say, I'm going to jail, I'll call when I get there, something like that. Which again explains why he asked for the police when he finally found a neighbor who was home when he escaped the second time successfully. Because at least going to jail, he would have food, even if he believed he was evil. It just breaks my heart. Anyway, I personally hope that Kevin never gets custody. I hope that those children are given every possible thing to help a good foster family that loves them and just coddles them and gives them all the love and comfort and support that they could possibly want. The only one good thing I think Kevin's done is file a motion to prevent Jodi from selling her massive house so that that money could possibly be used to help his children in therapy and medical bills moving forward. That's good on him for that. But you could have done so much more. With that, an episode of True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. Hope that was some insights, at least possibly to the faith, and some holes that could be plugged up. So please please subscribe. We're a brand new channel and we're growing, but I would love to see those numbers get higher. Really appreciate it. And so here's my Cadbury. Have a good day and have some chocolate.